welcome everybody. Welcome to our March HeadTalk. For those who don't know, I think you will know. I'm Andy Roberts, and today I'm pretty sure I'm talking about organisational debt, and I'll explain why I say that shortly. I'm going to start with something that should be familiar to most of you, or all of you, is technical debt. The reason I'm looking at that is because this is about debt. It's just organisational debt. Before I say organisational debt again, I'm just going to call it OD because I can't say that throughout this whole session, so we're going to call it OD from now on. So tech debt, most of you are aware of it. It was coined by Ward Cunningham back in 1992. Somebody might want to put me right on that, but I think it's about 1992. And that's his description of it. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to read that, but I'm also going to explain it in a minute. So I've read that, and I'm a slow reader, so I assume you've read it. Okay, so diagram on the right, I'll just put that together quickly. So my description of it is you've got a sponsor or owner or stakeholder that wants something doing, and everyone wants it now, don't they? They don't want it in 6 months or 12 months, they want it now. That's just standard when you build something. So what you have to do is deliver it faster than you can. And that's difficult for a development team, but it's what's normally asked. And in Agile, we would call that an MVP sometimes, wouldn't we? We build something that works, but isn't as good as it should be. But the whole point is that you get value out of that early, so they're getting that benefit, that payback. But obviously, you create a debt, don't you? Because it probably doesn't perform as well as it should. It probably hasn't got the features it needs. It probably falls over now and again. So what you have to do is go back and sort that out. So basically, that's the debt in this case. So the debt I'm talking to you about is not quite the same, but it's similar, but I just wanted to warm you up to what I'm talking about. So what type of debt am I talking about? So this comes back to me being pretty sure I'm talking about org debt. So what I didn't do was go searching for org debt and say, oh, that's interesting. I'll do a talk on that. For me, it's an experience that I've had throughout different jobs. I've seen it everywhere. And what I did was this thing I see, which I'll get into, I thought I better find out what they call that because I'm doing a talk. I've got to call it something. What do I call it? And firstly, I looked at operational debt, but that's not it. Operational debt is like tech debt. The process doesn't work that well, and it's filling the gaps to improve that process to reduce business risk. So that's what operational debt is, which is not what I'm talking about. So I found organizational debt, OD, and that's pretty close. I'm not saying it's exactly what I'm talking about, but it's as close as I could get. So I think that's what I'm talking about today. So what is OD? I've got a couple of quotes here, what it is. I thought we'd start with that. One from Scott Belsky, one from Steve Blank. Steve Blank's the guy who coined this, I think, in 2015. So he's the man that created the term, I guess. But let's look at those two. So I'm not going to read them out in full, but Scott Belsky is about not making decisions and how that impacts OD, whereas Steve Blank talks about the compromises it has on people and culture. And they're quite specific, though. So one's about not making decisions, and one's about trying to just get a job done, so you're rushing through it. Now, I think they're both right. My favorite part of that is the people and culture compromises, because that's what I'm talking about today. But I think it's much broader. I think you can create OD from so many things. So we have their thoughts, which I agree with, but I think they're very specific. So I'm just going to go through a few of the things, and they're quite high level, that I think cause OD. And I thought I'd try and give some information rather than just reading out what's on the screen. So I think you get it from changing and transforming, but not doing so. Why is that? Well, the first one's probably familiar. If you change and transform and you don't think about it and you don't think about your people and all the processes you're changing, you're going to create what I call OD. So you create problems with people, problems with teams, you frustrate people. But that can happen if you don't change anything, because there could be lots of things wrong in your organization. So if you do nothing, you create an OD because people are getting frustrated that nothing's changing. So this is a bit of a Mr. Belsky here, so not making decisions, but I also think it's making decisions, because you could make decisions that cause it. You could make some bad decisions. You can make decisions that impact people in how they work. You could make decisions that makes people's lives difficult or stressed. So either way, I think you're creating OD. Changing things too quickly, too slowly. So if you're changing things too quickly, you're transforming, but you're rushing it through, you're going to cause problems. But if you do it too slowly, there's frustrations in that. Things don't change quick enough. If a company says, yeah, we're going to do X and Y, but it never happens, it's going to frustrate people. So many ways you can cause it. And those are the core things. And then I get into other things. So interpretation of culture, and I'll try and explain that one. So we have a great culture, but it's the interpretation of it. So for example, if you say to people, we're an autonomous company, you go do. You own that, go do it. You need a bit more detail than that, I think, because they might interpret that as, oh, I can't go and ask for help, I just need to sort it out. And I own it, so I can spend as much money as I want. But that's probably not the case, is it? But some people may read it like that. And it may be there's constraints on budget. It may be that you should consult with people. You don't know everything, do you? Even if you're the expert and you own it, you won't know everything. You'll need to get help sometimes. And that wrong interpretation could cause a lot of problems and cause OD in the company. The OD there could be going up, if I should say up, but you might annoy your owners of a company, you might annoy your directors, and then that's reciprocated because they will hence annoy you because you've got something wrong. So there's lots of frustrations and people problems you cause with that. Leadership and capability, that's an interesting one because I think this is one of the biggest parts of it, to be honest. So a lot can be generated by leaders not knowing what they're doing. Doesn't mean they're not good leaders, can't be good leaders, but it's their capability, their skills. Can they deal with this OD? Do they know what it is? Can they spot it? Have they got the skills to resolve it? So leadership can drive it because they're not good enough at those things, but it's also a big component of helping resolve it. Consistency versus flexibility is an interesting one. We all like flexibility. Agile promotes flexibility, but I think you've got to balance that with consistency. So I'm trying to think of an example for consistency. Right, so if you are holding appraisals for a company, but that's quite, it's done in a very flexible way so people can run them as they want. You may find that some people are treated better than others, and people will find that out. So it would be better to have consistency. You need a balance. So in that case, so people are treated fairly. Because if people find out they're not, that can cause OD. You can cause frustration in people. People won't be happy. People won't work as well. People may not perform as well. All those things. So there's just one example of having some consistency in your setup. Clear strategy and goals. People like to know where they're going. And if they don't, I think that can be difficult. Some companies just give people tasks and they don't know what they're for. I don't think that works very well. People want to know what they're doing things for. And goals. I think everybody needs goals. So I'm a runner, and if I didn't set my 15 miles a week or 20, whatever I set, I wouldn't do it. Things drift if you don't set goals. But I set that goal and I go do it, and I think that's the same at work. It's good to have goals. People just drift without them. And finally, clear roles and purpose. I'm not saying to be too anal on this, but people need to be clear about what their role is and what they're doing. And the people that work with them need to be clear about that, else that can cause confusion, that can cause frustration, that can cause anger sometimes. So it's amazing how important something like that is. And I don't mean to the point where, somebody says, oh, I'm not doing that, that's not my job. I'm just saying that clarity in general about what they're doing, and people know how to work with them and what's their responsibility versus someone else's. Okay, so as I wrote these slides, I thought I'm explaining OD, and I've given a couple of quotes, but I feel like I'm not explaining it very well. That's what I thought. So I thought it might be an idea to give you a couple of examples of what I'm thinking about. I might be insulting your intelligence as well. You might be thinking, I know what OD is, Andy, but let's go through these examples and see if they help. So I've mentioned these three things, and the only reason I've put them up is, in a company, fact, you're going to do all these things at some point, unless you don't ever transform, but means you'll probably die. So you're going to transform, you're going to make decisions regularly, and sometimes you move too quickly and sometimes you move too slowly. So those things are going to happen. So as I said, I wanted to give you some examples. This first one isn't mine, and it's more on the proactive side of OD. So how do you contain OD before you, if you know it's coming, how do you plan for that? So this is Mr. Blank, again, this is Steve Blank stuff. And you can read this particular example in detail on his site on steveblank.com. It's quite interesting, actually. So he was consulting for a CEO of a company, and this CEO had a company of 100 people, and he knew it was going to grow in the next year or so to 200 and 300. Genuinely going to grow that much, and that's fast growth, that's huge, and that's quite hard to deal with. So his concept's right. He thought, I've got to think about this, I've got to transform to that, I've got to transition to that. How do I do that? So he decided to get a nice new building, put some nice furniture in it, and improve employee benefits, which are all good. Where he come a little bit unstuck on the income, on the salary side, he said, I'm going to reward my execs, and I'm going to pay all the new people that come in really good salaries. And it might sound obvious, and it might even sound like I'm making it up, because he sounds a bit of an idiot to some extent. But he's forgotten about the 100 staff that created his company, that have got his IP, and they're the people that have got it to a point where he can grow it that much. And as I said, you might think that's too obvious, but I don't know what it's like now, but I used to have Sky TV once upon a time, and I had it for years and years. And all I ever remember of Sky TV and why I packed it in was, if you're an existing customer, you got diddly. If you're a new customer, you got everything. Even after 10 years of being with Sky, you got nothing. So people do it. That's not unknown. Companies do it all the time. They don't look after their own in a lot of ways. So the OD there, so I can explain a bit more, the OD there for those 100 people is they might leave. If they don't leave, they might not perform. They might not care. So they're just becoming very ineffective, aren't they? And if you've got a lot of staff that are ineffective, your company's probably got a problem. So that's a bigger scale thing, and that's Steve Blank's stuff. Whereas I'm looking at it a bit differently, so I'm looking at it from perspective of reactive. And it's reactive at a person level. And I've got some just made up examples that try and help you understand where I'm going with this. So the first example is a product owner comes into a company. Obviously, they're new to the company. Their manager isn't skilled, hasn't got the knowledge, or people manager or people leader. So they're not backed up. They feel insecure. The environment doesn't help. So this person, with their insecurities, thinks, how can I feel secure? So what they end up doing is they end up, within the process of working with stakeholders as a product owner and with development team, they end up almost siding with the stakeholders and doing anything the stakeholder wants. That's what they end up doing, just to get that security. And they think, if the stakeholders like me, I'll keep my job for forever, sort of thing. But the problem with that is, obviously, the dev team will get frustrated because they're not working in a good way. They're probably not doing the best thing for the project or the piece of work. And what happens, they end up alienating that person and disliking that person, that product owner. So what happens there is that the OD there is going to cause potential problems with the project, delays the project, might even make the project fail because it's such an integral part of it. And the worst thing of it is, because it's hard to see, which I'll be talking about later, OD, what the development team can't see is probably not that person. In the scenario I've just given, it isn't that person. It's the surroundings. It's the insecurity. So if that manager had been better and said, I've got your back, you've just got to do the right thing for this project, that might have changed that. And then if you can recognize that, the dev team might have not disliked that person and thought, actually, let's help that person because obviously they're in a bad place. But it's hard to recognize. It's not that simple. So that's a more reactive, something happens and how do you deal with it? We'll talk about how we deal with it later. I thought I'd give another example, just to make sure we understand what I'm talking about. So we've got this HR manager that is good at their job. They're expert in it, but when they give guidance and advice, they're not listened to, or they're just ignored in what they're saying. And what that does is drive this person to be very frustrated because they think, I'm trying to do my job, but I can't. And all that's going to create is a person that's ineffective because they'll either not care anymore, and that's not good from a HR people perspective. They might just not perform as well. They might not care as much. They might even get a bit harsh because they're just frustrated and impatient and struggling with everything. At the end of the day, they're less effective. it's the same thing again. But there's lots of reasons there. I've given 3 there, but there's many more it could be. It could be that the structure's not understood, so we don't understand what that person is meant to be doing. It could be that they're not the expert. That could be an outcome, but it could be they're just not perceived to as well, which are 2 very different things. Or it could be not everybody's aligned to how we're supposed to work. And then that comes back to interpretation of culture. So they're just 2 examples of reactive. And they're really important for me to explain, because this is my experience, not the proactive stuff. A lot of people know how to deal with that. They know how to create that. It's this reactive thing, I think, that's missed, because these are pockets that people can't see. So your CEO, your COO, they can't see the pockets. And that's why I think leaders are so important, because it's the leaders that have one-to-ones with people. It's the leaders that know what their team are doing. So they'll see if somebody who used to be really vocal and contribute has suddenly gone quiet. So there's a little tip of, if somebody's suddenly changing behavior, worth checking that out. There might be something that's wrong there. But only that leader or the people in that team will see that. So it's pockets, and they'll only know that specific one case in isolation where there could be many cases. So I've said, what's the big deal? A couple of unhappy people. Who cares? Not going to break the company, not going to break the bank. But what's going on is, as you grow, you change, and you just make decisions or not, you don't know the extent of that OD. And that's down to these pockets that can't be seen. So one person might have 1 incident of OD, but there could be 50 in your company, but you see that one. So growing OD is a problem, I think. And as I've said, sometimes it's hard to see. And it's interesting when I say hard to see. So it might be hard to recognize a behavior or somebody's really not performing, they're ineffective, but you should be able to see that. The hardest thing to see is what's causing it. And that's really important, because you can't fix it without knowing that cause. So yes, so you might get frustrated and angry with someone because of the way they're operating, but until you know that cause, you can't help them with that. So there needs to be skill in leaders. You could take that further, but I think the leaders play a big part, because they have this overview of what's going on in the team or their department or whatever. So I think it's really important for the leaders to have those skills and knowledge to deal with it. And what's really hard is to know how much exists, and maybe you can do something about that, which we'll talk about later. But you could have 50% of your company that's moaning in the background. You don't know, you could do. And 50% ineffective people isn't great, is it? In any company. So if not managed, these are the things I think you see, low performance, poor, maybe that should have been poor performance. Lack of belief. Why would somebody have a lack of belief? Might be that they've been at a company a long time, and things a company have said are going to happen don't. And every time you go to do something, it's like, well, that never happened. You must have all seen that, or somebody said that to you. And that's OD. Somebody's given up almost, and something has to change. You have to help that person, or something has to change. A lack of care, whatever. Just I don't know if things never say, could be a similar thing. Things never happen. What's the point? My ideas are never listened to. What's the point? I don't care anymore. Lack of respect. That can grow from similar things not happening, things not changing, people not supporting you, people not listening to you. It's all similar things. Then the last thing there's interesting that I see a lot of in everywhere I've worked, a growing moan. And you can't, your CEOs, they don't see that stuff. The growing moan is somebody chats to someone and says, did you hear about that the other day? I can't believe that happened. Oh, yeah. And then the next person gets on the bandwagon and goes, you're right, yeah, that's rubbish, isn't it? And then them two talk to someone else, yeah. And you get this growing moan. And it might not have been as bad, but you're creating this thing that grows, and it could be something common in your company, but you'll never know, potentially, because people ain't going to come and tell the owner, the CEO, they're just telling all their mates, oh, this is rubbish, yeah. And that can really be impactful. The OD that can create is phenomenal. And I'm sure you've done it, I've done it, and I'm sure you've seen it, where I've had a moan about someone else. Sometimes you just can't help it, it happens. So I did mention it was hard to identify, and that's because it happens unknowingly. And how do you fix something invisible? And that's what I've talked about, isn't it? How do you recognize it? I suppose for me, recognizing that first bit is changes in behavior. So a team that performs superbly, if it's suddenly performing badly, there's something going on there, you might want to check that out. If, so as I said, if somebody's vocal and they're suddenly quiet, if somebody's quiet but they're suddenly loud but in a negative way, all these things are signs that there's something not right. And it might not sound much one person, but one person can have a huge impact. Depends how much influence they've got on what's going on. So I think it's really important to be able to recognize it. And I could talk about that for a long time, but I'm trying to do this in half an hour because I don't think anyone should have to listen to somebody continuously for longer than half an hour. That's my view on the world. Hard to resolve. I think it's hard to resolve because of lack of skills. What I've talked about with leaders and generally with all people, because I think it's everybody's responsibility. So people need to, understand it and be able to deal with it. Fear of conflict's a massive one, isn't it? Trouble with this sort of stuff, it runs quite deep, and it could be, it could go back to culture, it could go back to somebody not being very good at what they do. You've got to go deal with that. If you see it and you're going to help someone, you might have to go, for example, and talk to somebody's manager and say, "You're not doing a very good job looking after this person, are you?" So it's conflict, and most people hate conflict. I like it sometimes, but most people don't like it, do they? And perception, it's back to who cares, what's the big deal? It's a person, because that's all you can see. It's a team, that's a bigger thing, but the perception is it's not a big deal, I think. Because I don't see people dealing with it in any of the companies I've been in. I don't see them recognizing it, then doing something about it. Not wholly. So I've created doom and gloom, haven't I? Companies aren't they? We're done. So what do we do about it? I better talk a bit about that, hadn't I? Just to lift it. So what can you do about it? So again, I'm going to raise these proactive measures, but a lot of you probably know these because I think the proactive side of this is seen, it's known. So I'll talk more about the reactive, which I'm more interested in, but I will raise this. So usual change management stuff, really. So if you're taking action, changing things, think of the potential impacts on your processes, on your people. Think about how much it might impact different areas. Think about how you can mitigate that. That's standard, isn't it, in change? I've been talking a lot about this, upfront leader knowledge training. I think it's really key. As a company, we're doing loads of that at the moment because I think it's so important. And then this is one of the reasons. People like to know where they're going. So have a vision, have a strategy, make sure people understand it. Make sure in the main, even if they're not overly happy with it, they understand it. Next thing there is investment meets your plan. You can turn it around and say your plan meets your investment. So be realistic, So if you've got this master plan, but you can't afford it, it's probably going to fall on its bottom, isn't it? So make sure that there's reality in that plan and whether you can afford to do that plan. The interpretation of culture, I've said, which I've talked about, and interpretation of structure. And I've also really talked about, the structure of your setup of people being autonomous, being owners of things. That was the example of that. So I think all those things are the upfront things you can do. There's probably more. It's a good start. So before I get into the reactive, I just wanted to use another comparison, really. So upfront is not enough. And all you guys are IT folk. So I'm going to use traditional model, so don't beat me up, just for the reason of explanation, okay? So you build a product for 6 months, it's built, and then you can test it for 6 weeks, or you can test it for 12 months. Whichever of them you do, in my experience, when you release it, it'll still have bugs. So what I'm trying to say there is you can be as proactive as you like, but you won't pick up everything. So in OD, it's the same. You can do all those proactive things I've just shown you, but you will have OD after the fact. And the bit of difference in this is that here, at least, you shouldn't create more bugs unless somebody tells me you could when you release it. But in OD, as you do it, you could be creating OD as soon as it goes in. Not just have what was there from not getting it right, but you could create more from that point. So it's a growing problem. You can't stop it. You cannot mitigate OD, you can control it. So reactively, what can you do about it? So I think it's making people aware of it. You know, what is it? And I'm going to sum it up at the end what I think it is. Communicate it. Communicate how to deal with it. So this is all about that, people understanding what it is and doing something about it. Got to understand how to recognize it, because often it's not seen. It's really hard to see, and that cause is even harder to see. So that's quite tough, that side of it, really. Your leaders are important in this. They really are, because they see all, or should see all, in their section, in their area, and they should know. You know, they should be skilled in this area. And I know often leaders have got a day job and they're leaders, but you know, I think it's part of the role. And people are just going to have to pick it up. Continuous maintenance. I've just said it just grows and grows. It's constantly growing, so you're never getting rid of it. But it's a maintenance job. It's like training a dog. You never stop training a dog. If you train it for a year and stop, they regress. It's a similar thing, that you just can't stop this. You've just got to keep on top of it. So, you know, it's growing, you kick it down, it's growing, you kick it down. That's what you do. And one thing I thought might help with all of this and help the leaders is create a sharing platform. I don't know, like a community of practice where you get together and you actually talk about the OD in your little isolation spot. And what might help there is you might have the same things. You might have the same things crop up from different people, and you could see patterns, and there could be OD that you could deal with on a larger scale. In fact, I think you almost guaranteed to find, because often things like this are something in the culture, somewhere there's a big change that's really annoyed everybody. Like I don't know, putting in a new system that's really rubbish, for example, which happens quite a lot. We know that, don't we? You often put in a new system that's not as good as the last one. It happens all the time. So things like that. And then you could recognize that and find a way of dealing with that. So I think that would be very useful. So getting close to the end now, so I didn't want to bore you to death. So my final thoughts, that can grow fast, and I think it's a rot, I do, because of that growing moan. And I see it so many times, and it honestly, everywhere I've worked, it worries me if it starts growing too much. And you've got to find a way of dealing with that and controlling that. So I know I've said a lot of it, but I thought I'd summarize. I'm sure you can read those things. What haven't I spoke about? Easy to ignore, I haven't really mentioned. I think it is easy to ignore, especially if it's difficult to deal with. You might want to ignore it, mightn't you? And so that's something that can be problematic in dealing with it. And the last one. This will be much harder if you haven't got a people-first culture, because this is all about people, isn't it? It's all about keeping your people in a good place. So I suppose finally, what would I say it is in a nutshell? I'd say it's the things you do, you change, the actions you take that make people ineffective, make them lack belief, make them not want to do their job, make them bored of their job, make them not driven, make them not want to get up for work in the morning. So I'd say that's what OD is. It's that degradation in people's capability and want to work for a company. And if you haven't got your people working well for you, your company's not going to do well. It may even fold. So I do think it's highly important, personally. So that's all, folks. Even if you're not speeding it up, my response to that would be you wouldn't slow it down. You're just dealing with it. And that's why I say it doesn't go away. So you can keep going at that quicker pace, but if people are good with dealing with it and stamping on that debt and fixing it or making it better, then you can still go at that pace as long as that's being done and you're keeping those people on side. So we've all been there, haven't we, where changes are made and people don't like it, but as long as you take them on the journey and explain it's for the greater good, sorry, your process isn't as good as it was, most people go, yeah, okay, I get it. And then at least you brought them on the journey. If you just throw it at them and it's rubbish and you don't explain, there's OD, isn't there? So it's more about dealing with it, reacting. That's why I think the reactive part of it is much more important than the proactive. And it's just, often you'd say be proactive when that would be in general, you'd say best to be proactive. But in this case, I think you can't avoid the future OD, so you've just got to try and be very reactive and knock it on the head where you see it as much as you can. But yeah, I don't think it would slow anything down because of that, because you're just dealing with that in parallel, which gives somebody more work, but it's for the greater good, as I would say. My first thought is go at the pace you want and try and deal with it. And if that's becoming a real struggle, maybe you pare it back a bit. Because it may be that you can go at that pace and deal with it. If you've got people that are prepared to deal with it and they're good at it, you may be able to just, squash the problems, the OD, and keep going at that pace. So it's how focused you are on dealing with it, I guess. So if you're moving fast and you're just changing process and you're just smashing through, you're just going to have to deal with the people or the teams or the departments that affects. And if you're good at dealing with that and explaining it and helping them through that pain, it might be doable. You might be able to still move stupidly fast, but keep it contained, basically. And you might accept some of the impact. You may have to, because, I'm realistic. Some companies may just have to move faster or they disappear, for example. So all you can do is move as fast as you need to and try and cope with it. That's the reality. Because I'm not going to be unrealistic and say, yes, you're going to have to slow right down because of OD. No, just find out how to deal with it. If you could slow down a bit, if it helped more, and you could accept that, maybe that is what to do. So if I was the person who could identify that and saw that, the first thing I'd do is talk to the team and try and explain that, I know this person's really peed you off, but you do realise it's not them, don't you? Well, probably not them, and it's probably the environment they're in, and get the team to work in a different way with that person and try and bring them on board. Because it's not the team's fault, because they can't see that cause, and that's why I talked about that. So all they can see is this person being a pain in the hole. That's all they can see, isn't it? So that person is like, oh, what a pain. We can't get things done. We can't, we're getting pressured because of this person. But if they understood the cause, so if there's someone there who's got the knowledge and say, well, actually, their manager isn't very good, and not saying they're not, and the environment's really poor for them, so they're really insecure in their role, try and work with them, talk to them about that, try and get them to understand what would be best for the project. And then if that doesn't work, that person who spots that might go and talk to their manager, for example. So it depends, and that's why I said some of this runs deep. So if you have to go and do something like that, that's quite challenging probably, because you may even be talking to a manager of a client that you don't even know. So that some of these things are quite confrontational in some cases. And then that's when people start ignoring things, because it's like, that's too hard. I'll just let that be and not worry about it. So it's a tough thing to deal with, but that would be those are the two steps I'd look at. The reason I suggested the leaders and the community of practice is just an idea, because those are the people that will see it, because I think it is very siloed. It's isolated pockets of OD, so it's not just one big thing. I think the difficulty with having the group for everyone, it's a great idea, but I think you need the right culture and people. A lot of people don't want to say these things. They just don't. Whether if you've got the best, openest, if that's a word, company on the planet, people still don't want to say of fear of certain things. So I think them things they're great ideas. I just think they're hard in reality. That Joe Bloggs, who's just joined the company and is really peed off about something, will slam something on there, and even if it's anonymous, people think it's anonymous. So I think that's really hard, that side of things. So the leader's idea is there because they're seeing, if they're doing a good job of being a leader, they'll know what's going on in their area in its entirety. So if those leaders, if every leader in a company got together periodically and talked about OD, you'd probably see commonalities. I think it's one of the best ways of doing it. So rather than people having to stick their necks out and moan about things openly, those leaders have seen those things, dealt with those things, and they can share their experiences. And as I say, there probably would be a pattern somewhere where you say, oh, right, so what's causing that? Oh, it's this thing we did in the company in the last 3 months. Oh, right, so what do we do about it? That's why I've mentioned that. But I'm sure there's many ways of doing it. Anything else? We all good? Thank you for listening, folks. Thanks for taking that half an hour, which I think it took.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.